Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator for the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and is supported by the Washington Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Guilherme Casarões, who is a senior researcher at the Brazilian Center for International Relations. He is a professor at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in São Paulo. He holds a master's degree in international relations from the State University of Campinas and a master's and a doctorate in political science from the University of São Paulo. He researches topics related to Brazilian foreign policy, Latin American politics, and the rise of the extreme right in Brazil and in the world. He was a visiting fellow at Tel Aviv University in Israel and Brandeis University and the University of Michigan in the United States. Welcome to Brazil Unfiltered, Guilherme.
Jim, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
So we're taping this the day after the election, so hopefully to air soon thereafter. Let's talk a little bit about what happened yesterday, what happened on Sunday in São Paulo, in Brazil, with the elections. What's your take? First of all, let's talk about the results. What are the final results?
Well, first of all, just a disclaimer. I was going live with Al Jazeera yesterday, so I was in front of Lula's hotel for the entire afternoon and evening. So I had the pleasure to see people coming in, people celebrating when Lula took over Bolsonaro as results were being counted. So it was a very happy moment for everyone who was there. And the Paulista Avenue, the main avenue in São Paulo, was full of people. So everyone was celebrating a lot. And I understand that most people who were celebrating were not just celebrating Lula's victory, but also Bolsonaro's defeat. So that's the situation that we have in Brazil right now, a deeply polarized and radicalized country, a country where the two candidates who went to the second round, to the runoff of elections, got more than 50 million votes each. Lula was elected with a little bit more than 60 million votes. Bolsonaro came second with 58 million votes or something like that. So the country is really divided right now. And I think that it was important to see Lula's victory as the first step towards safeguarding democracy in Brazil, towards recovering dignity and pluralism in Brazil, but it's not the final. We didn't. The war is not won. So it was just the first battle of many battles to come.
So what happened in the first round of the elections? The far right won significant seats in the Congress, especially the Senate. Do you want to give a kind of a sense of the overall balance of powers between the Câmara, the House, or the lower parliament, the lower chamber of the Congress, the Senate, and the executive at this point?
Yeah, the far right is here to stay, right? This is something that really strikes me, but it's part of a global movement, right? I've been doing research on the far right for 5 years now, ever since Trump got elected in the United States. It sort of caught my attention because I really thought that after Trump got elected in the US, back in 2016, Brazil would follow suit. It was just a matter of time before Brazil was also captured by far-right forces, because they are very much transnational at this point, right? They keep talking about sovereignty, but the far-right, the contemporary far-right is extremely organized on a transnational level. And that's the reason why I think last year Steve Bannon gave an interview saying that the Brazilian presidential elections were the single most important elections for the future of the Western civilization, or something like that.
And I think also Bannon tweeted on Sunday saying that before the results were in, that the election was fraudulent and you couldn't trust it, and was already preparing the big lie. So he's out there trying to influence what's going on in Brazil, certainly.
Yeah, and this is part of a big narrative that the far right loves, the idea of electoral fraud, the idea of the system trying to subvert the results against the nationalist patriotic forces all across the world. I mean, it's commonplace. We kind of saw it coming, right? I mean, it's not due to anyone. The kind of narrative that the far right is trying to push forward in Brazil and in other parts of the world. But I think that if we look at the results of the first round, I mean, it really shows a picture of a very different Brazil from the one we were used to prior to 2018, because now we have a big parliamentary base that is pro Bolsonaro. We used to have a very flexible right wing in Brazil, very clientelistic. It was a right wing that operated mostly on patronage and pork barreling, right? But what we see now is a slightly different kind of right, which is fundamentally ideological. And because of that, it will be much harder for Lula or for any other president, to be honest, to maneuver or to create a good relationship with Congress, which is fundamental in a country like Brazil that has a multi-party system. And it's not just any kind of multi-party system. It's a highly fragmented multi-party system, very different from the United States, by the way, because you see Biden, he got elected, and then he's got the majority of both Senate and the House. This is not the Brazilian reality. So by electing 99 seats in the lower house, and I think he's got some 19 or 17 senators in the Senate. That's going to make Lula's life very, very hard from a legislative point of view. And of course, from yesterday's results, what really struck me was Lula has got 3 million votes more.
I think he got. Oh, right, before than the last time.
Yeah. 3 million votes more than in the first round, and Bolsonaro's got 7 million more votes than in the first round. So we see that many people who could have voted for Lula because they had voted for a third way in the first round, like Tebet or Ciro Gomes, they have ended up voting for Bolsonaro, most of them. So I think that it reveals two things about Brazil. The first thing is the far right is here to stay. The value-driven kind of politics that the far right loves because they tap into fears, they tap into hate. That's the kind of politics that's going to be around for a long time in Brazil. And the second message that yesterday's results tell us is that the anti-Workers' Party sentiment is still very strong. We knew it was strong ever since the impeachment trial of President Rousseff back in 2016. We saw everything that happened prior to the impeachment and the whole coup process. And then we thought that the anti-Workers' Party sentiment would just reduce at some point. We thought that Brazil was ready to a reorganization of political forces, and that's not really what we saw yesterday. I mean, anti-Petismo or anti-Workers' Party sentiments are still very strong, and I think that one of the greatest signals that Lula has sent during the campaign was that he's not going to run for a second term right now. So he's not going to try to be president for 4 terms in office. And it's important because he has really embraced the idea of pacifying the country, of healing the country's wounds. He's going to be a transition. He's going to lead a transition government, which is probably the most important transition government in the history of the country. Because what Lula was able to do at the end of the day was to form an unprecedented national unity front. And this is really meaningful because only Lula could do it. Even though Lula is very polarizing on the one hand, and even though there's a lot of hate against Lula, I think that Lula is by far the most important and the most seasoned political figure in the history of the country, and the only one who would be able to put so many people together from all across the board, left wing, right wing, center, and he's going to govern looking into 2026. I think that's the end game for Lula. He's going to make a successful transition for whoever is apt to take office in 2026, trying to do away with Bolsonarismo as an organized movement.
I was at Paulista Avenue last night after we finished a special edition of Brazil Unfiltered, and was very impressed with his speech. It was very different from the one I heard in 2003 when I also was on Paulista Avenue, about the same distance from him, about 50 meters away, listening to him and filming. Much more sophisticated, much more sensitive to a series of questions that parts of the left have been raising. He gave an amazing indication of his concern about women and the role of women in society, talking about the appointment of an indigenous person to head a new ministry of indigenous rights, talking about really reinstating all the progressive programs that had happened under his and Dilma Rousseff's government. And, you know, when Lula left office in 2010, in spite of the scandals surrounding him in 2005, 2006, what were known as the Big Monthly or the Mensalão scandals, he left with 87% popularity. He was extremely popular. And my sense is that Lula wants to leave office in 4 years being the most popular, loved president in the history of the country. And for him to do that, he has to pull off this big, major social program agenda that he's pointed out. Is that going to be possible with this large coalition of political forces from the center, even the center right, to the left, to the far left? Is it possible for him to keep that coalition together, or will it splinter in the next couple of years?
Well, I think he'll be able to do it, and I hope he'll be able to do it. And I think that by now, most people in Brazil, regardless of ideology, who believe in democracy, I think these people have finally come to understand that there's no possible democracy in Brazil without alleviating poverty, ending hunger in the country. Because this is what Bolsonaro did not do for his 4 years in office. I mean, Bolsonaro is one of the least empathetic people to ever be in the presidency of the country. So he didn't care about anyone who was suffering. We saw that in the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw that when it came to hunger issues. Remember when he said, I mean, he said it many times, I don't think there's hunger in the country because I see no people asking for food. I mean, that's one of the most awkward kinds of like logical argumentation, but still he would say that time and time again. So I think that many people who gave a vote against Bolsonaro, they understand the importance of the social programs that Lula has successfully undertaken for most of his time in office. I think it's possible to combine sound macroeconomic policies, as in Lula's first term, for example, 2003, 2006, and a very robust social program structure. And I think that there is a path to that, especially because with the exception of the Bolsonaro camp in Congress, he will have the support of politicians from all across the board who understand that at the end of the day, if they support social programs in Congress, they may well get reelected in 2026. So I think Lula might tap on politicians' electoral demands to help push for this robust, this very sound cash transfer program or social policies more broadly. And I think Lula knows how to do it. I mean, he's by far the most experienced politician in the country. And I totally agree with you. He wants to leave office as the most popular president in the history of Brazil, because that's his legacy, right? I was talking to so many people prior to the elections. And of course, one of the most frequent questions was, why did Lula decide to run again? Because he knows he's divisive. He knows that there are many people who hate him for who he is and for what he represents, right? And we know that it's not just about corruption. It's a very deep prejudice against Lula for everything that he represents. So why did he decide to run? And one of the answers that I very often got from friends of mine who even worked in Lula's campaign was Lula wants to offer a legacy to the country, and his legacy is prior to the 2022 race, his legacy had been tainted by the car wash operation, the way he was put in jail in 2018, the way he was prevented from racing the 2018 elections. So I think that now he wants a very positive comeback. And people used to talk about revenge. It's not about revenge. He really wants to leave a legacy for this country because he knows he's able to do it. And he wouldn't have run at 77. He's just turned 77. Wow. At 77, he wouldn't be willing to run against all odds to be a worse president than he was in his first two terms. So I think that I really trust this drive and this feeling that Lula is there to heal the wounds of the country. I'm not sure if he's going to be able to do it. I mean, in 4 years, 4 years is such a short time in political terms, but I think it's a magnificent start.
There's something that really struck me this year as I've been living in Brazil and watching what's going on. I've never really watched Global News, which is the news channel of the largest media conglomerate in Brazil. And in the past, they were extremely anti-Lula. They very much supported Lava Jato, the car wash operation, and were very critical of his regime. And what's striking over the last 3 months, watching them, is the hatred, the disgust, the opposition to Bolsonaro was so strong that although I don't know how these people voted, I have a feeling all of them voted for Lula on Sunday. And I'm sure some of them will turn their tone against him and become very critical, but there is a feeling out there that I see from large sectors of the population that a broad front to defend democracy is essential, and that Lula understood that and spoke to that. So all of the arguments that Brazil will become another Cuba or Venezuela fall very flat on these people because they realize that Brazil is very different and the situation is very different. I'm very curious, though, Guilherme, to see your analysis of a very interesting phenomenon, which was the Party of Brazilian Social Democracy, the party that elected Fernando Henrique Cardoso to 2 terms in office, the party which was the opponent of the Workers' Party in all the elections since 1994, and the party or the grouping within the political spectrum that the media, the mainstream media, expected to launch a candidate which they called the third way, which never got off the ground, never managed to get a strong candidate. And in fact, at the end of the day, the candidate that did best was Simone Tebet of the Brazilian Democratic Movement, getting 5% of the votes and then immediately endorsing and supporting Lula's candidacy. So first of all, what happened to the PSDB? Does it have a possibility of coming back? It did win several governorships on Sunday night. Rio Grande do Sul, Eduardo Leite, the openly gay governor, the newly elected, re-elected governor of Rio Grande do Sul, and Raquel Lira in Pernambuco, defeating the granddaughter of a very important left leader and a person who had been close to the Workers' Party. What might be the fate of this third way as it's been articulated by traditional politicians?
Oh, that's a great question, Jim. I mean, there's no such thing as a third way in such a polarized and radicalized environment. So the 2022 experience has shown us that it's very hard to be a third way if half the country really hates Bolsonaro for everything he has done. And half the country hates Lula for many different reasons, and the Workers' Party sentiment is still very strong. So I think that Lula was the third way. He was the first and the third in many different ways. I mean, and he really understood that the 2022 race was about democracy. And I agree with you. I think that Lula has this sense of history and historical timing, right? And it's very different from what we saw back in 2002, for example, because 2002 was the time the left was poised to become the government. So it was very important for you and for me. It was my first vote for president, and I was thrilled because that was the moment the first man from the people, the first metal worker, could pave the way into getting elected. I mean, he had tried 3 times before, and the elites would never let him become the president. And then he became the president in this beautiful win in 2002. So I think that the situation is very different now. I mean, Lula's victory was also beautiful on Sunday night, but it meant something else, because it meant the renewal or the revival of Brazilian democracy. Because what Bolsonaro did in the last 4 years was to destroy any possibility of building policies on democratic grounds. There was no dialogue. There's this expression, no retreat, no surrender. That's what Bolsonaro did most of the time. I mean, he kept like moving and destroying institutions and challenging democracy and energizing his supporters to be as violent as they could be. And he never took a step back, right? And that's interesting, because that's how the far right operates as well, because they need this environment of crisis and radicalization. So he didn't want to take any steps back. And now he's been silent for more than 12 hours ever since the results were final. So let me get back to the point. I think that Lula, and that's why he's got so much support from the media conglomerates and from even center-right parties. Lula was the only possibility for restoring democracy in the country. And of course, I imagine political forces will try to reorganize themselves in the years to come, right? But the Social Democratic Party, that's a very interesting thing, because they used to be so powerful. Up until 2014, they were the single most powerful opposition force in Brazilian politics. And I think that they've made so many mistakes along the way, of course. They've embraced the far right in 2014. I think that's the reason why many people were suspicious of Aécio Neves' candidacy, because he was signaling to many different political forces, including those who are not really democratic. And the fact that he challenged the elections results the day after Rousseff got elected, I mean, that was a very clear break with the tradition of the Social Democratic Party from 1988, 1989. I mean, Mario Covas, the one who founded the Social Democratic Party back in 1988, he was probably rolling in his grave as Aécio Neves was challenging the elections results, because I mean, that was very different from what the Social Democrats used to do. I mean, they might have taken some neoliberal turns along the way, but they were very democratic too at heart, right? And ever since 2014, what we saw was a completely lost Social Democratic Party, because on the one hand, they needed to capture the far right votes, and on the other hand, they needed to preserve democratic values. I think that João Doria is the main expression of this ambiguity, because João Doria is, I mean, if we look at the trajectory of the party, he is by far the most radical politician in the history of social democracy.
And for our listeners, João Doria was the mayor of the city of São Paulo. He ran, was elected, and then 2 years later, although he promised not to, he ran for governor and was a governor. And in the 2018 elections, he endorsed Bolsonaro and actually said he was the Bolso Doria candidate, mixing his name with that of Bolsonaro. So he represented, and then he broke with Bolsonaro after he was elected, tried to carry out a relatively effective anti-COVID-19 policy, ran into conflicts with the federal government as a result of that. I just wanted to make clear for it. So Doria, as you said, was this candidate that represented this kind of move to the right, or the far right of the PSDB.
Yeah, and at the same time, Alckmin, who was his political godfather, as we call it in Portuguese, he has even changed parties, right? He has gone to the Socialist Party, Brazilian Socialist Party, and now he's Lula's vice president. So I think it's interesting to see that the original group that founded the Social Democratic Party back in 1988, now they are part of Lula's National Unity Front. And many people who have remained in the PSDB endorsed Lula even before the first round. So I think that's a very interesting thing. I mean, maybe if the Social Democrats are to, I don't know, revamp themselves and are to become a very strong party again, they need to build it from the inside out, right? They need to be part of the government. They need to help Lula govern, right? And of course, all the options are open for 2026. So they might be heading the ticket. They might be somewhere. Trying to form another national unity government in 2026, depending on how strong Bolsonaro is. And so I think that there are ways for a democratic right, democratic center right in Brazil. But we have lost this perspective because the right has been captured almost entirely by the far right. It's just like in the United States. If you think about the Republican Party, there are figures in the Republican Party who are very moderate and very democratic, but we don't get to hear from them very often because the mainstream Republican Party has been totally captured by Trumpism. So I think it's the same. And on the one hand, it's hard to live in a multi-party system because it's so hard to form coalitions and to form a stable majority. But on the other hand, parties they are much more flexible to recreate themselves and to reestablish their original platforms, as in the case of the Social Democrats.
One of the things that was really striking to me about this electoral process was that in 2018, when Fernando Haddad, who was Lula's vice presidential candidate originally, after Lula was imprisoned, ended up running on his behalf. Between the first and second round, many colleagues from Brazil contacted me and Barbara Weinstein and asked if we could help them encourage international supporters of Cardoso, people who had worked with him, to call on Cardoso to vote for Haddad, and he refused to do that. He was silent on the elections in 18. So it was very striking that before the first round, he sent this very ambiguous message saying he wanted to support democratic forces and basically was saying he was going to support Lula, and then, in fact, endorsed Lula, and then immediately congratulated him on his victory. I think saving his legacy, because had he been absent in this election, he would have been seen as one of the forces that really did not, at the end of the day, live up to his democratic discourse. And what's striking is the other candidate out there, Ciro Gomes, of the Brazilian Labor Party, who had run several times before for president, and refused to see the situation and had a pox on both houses against Bolsonaro, against Lula. He ended up getting very, very few votes, basically endorsed Lula without even mentioning his name, disappeared, came back and said, I'm supporting the candidate of my party, voted, but really, I think, lost his credibility. So the question I have for you is, will figures like Eduardo Leite, who in his race in Rio Grande do Sul did not endorse Bolsonaro or endorse Lula, will someone like that be able to get onto the national stage, become a serious contender in 2026 if they don't clearly take one side or the other in this dispute? Or was that purely electoral opportunism or electoral strategy of his not to alienate Bolsonaro supporters who might vote for him, and certainly not lose the support of the Workers' Party bloc, which almost won the first round of the elections?
Yeah. Well, I think that we have to put things in context. Back in 2018, many political leaders underestimated Bolsonaro, and they really didn't see Bolsonaro as a threat to democracy. I was doing research on the far right, and I sort of knew it. You knew it. Many people on the progressive camp like us knew it, but it wasn't clear for people who were seduced by the liberal narrative of Bolsonaro and Paulo Guedes. I mean, there was a siren's call, right? Many people thought that, I mean, they could manage Bolsonaro's authoritarian leanings, right?
And
they
so,
could
for our
tame
listener, Paulo
Bolsonaro.
Guedes was the Minister of Economy, very
Yeah,
traditional economic policies, neoliberal economic policies, who was put forth by Bolsonaro even before the election to assure the markets that he was not going to do anything that countered kind of a neoliberal project.
yeah, and that's the kind of things that we used to hear back in 2018. I'm not voting for Bolsonaro. I don't care about him. I don't like him. I'm voting for Paulo Guedes, right? Because he's a very competent economist, which he's not. But many people were seduced by this kind of narrative, and of course, from day one of Bolsonaro's administration, it seemed clear that he was not there to respect democracy. He was not there to play by the rules. He kind of packed the executive branch with military officials, evangelical fundamentalists of all kinds, the most predatory kind of rural producers in the country. So that's the kind of government, a government of lobbyists that we had for the last 4 years. So I think that by 2022, many people came to understand finally that Bolsonaro wasn't a Democrat at all. So they've kind of scrambled to save their own legacies. That was the situation of Cardoso, for example. I think that the silence of leaders like Cardoso has taken a big toll on the Social Democratic Party, because they've decided not to position themselves, and when they did, they kind of leaned towards Bolsonaro, and now it seems clear that they didn't benefit from that. I mean, one of the most visible elements of Bolsonaro's modus operandi, of Bolsonaro's dynamics, is whoever does not agree with him automatically becomes a traitor, and a traitor gets an even more severe punishment than the ones who used to be considered enemies in the first place. So the traitors of Bolsonarismo as a movement have been punished in the ballots. That was the case of Doria, that was the case of Joyce Hasselman and Alexandre Frota, and even Eduardo Leite in the beginning. He was considered a traitor of the Bolsonaro movement, right? I think that Leite has also understood that being an openly gay politician is not compatible with what Bolsonarism stands for. It took him a long time to understand that, but I think that he's finally understood that if he wants to run a moderately progressive platform, he has to cooperate with people who are on his side of the trench. And it's clear that the ones who are with him on the trench are the Workers' Party and Lula and everyone who represents this progressive and democratic side of Brazilian politics. Now, Ciro Gomes is a different thing, because I have worked with him back in the day. I know from experience that he's one of the smartest people I've ever met. I mean, he's very, very knowledgeable, and he really has a plan for the country. He has a project for the country, which is not incompatible with Lula's, really. But the problem is, you can't, I'm not sure if that's the same saying in English, but you can't do politics with your liver, right? You can't think of politics from the perspective of resentment, because resentment at the end of the day was what moved Bolsonarismo in the first place. And Ciro Gomes has positioned himself as a very, if not the most resented politician in the recent history of the country. Even Brizola, who's the original laborist politician from the 1960s through the 90s, even Brizola voted for Lula in 1994. He was the vice presidential candidate in 1998. So I think that Ciro didn't have the dignity to accept that he was not the man to get to the second round. He should have given up on his candidacy well before the first round to prevent all the chaos that we have seen between the two rounds. But it's hard to tell a resented person that it's time to go, right? And apparently the way Ciro has endorsed Lula was the worst possible, because he didn't even mention Lula's name. And now I think he goes down as an irrelevant political figure for the future of Brazil. He's not going to come back in 2026, or at least that's my immediate take on what's going to happen to him.
Let's move to the international arena, because you're an expert in Brazilian foreign policy. And I'm very curious to hear how you see Lula will reposition himself in the world. I was just interviewed by a press this morning and tried to explain the Lula of 2010 is not the Lula of 2022. His base of support is different. The political context is different, and his coalition is different. So how do you see Lula position himself on the world stage?
Jim, I really don't think the coalition plays a decisive role in how Lula makes foreign policy, because foreign policy is one of the few things that is almost exclusive to the executive branch in Brazil. So it doesn't depend on congressional approval. Most of the things that he will do, he's going to do on his own behalf as the president of Brazil. I think that there are two or three very different things between Lula of 2003 and Lula of 2023. When it comes to foreign policy, of course, the first thing is Lula is 77, so he's probably not going to travel as much. Lula has traveled. I mean, he has spent, I'm not sure if our listeners know this, he has spent more than 450 days in his 8 years in office outside of the country, shaking hands and signing treaties and pushing for very progressive agendas on the international stage, bilateral, multilateral, regional, you name it. So he's not going to do it for obvious reasons. He's in a different position right now. So I think that one of the key things to look into is who's going to be his next foreign minister. Celso Amorim, the longtime foreign minister of the Lula administration, he's of course the obvious name, but he's also not at his height. I mean, he's probably going to make the next foreign minister, but he's not going to be the next foreign minister. And I really think, and that's my personal position, I really think that Lula should think of a woman as the next foreign minister, because this is something that Brazil lags behind when compared to any other big Latin American country. We are the only big Latin American country that hasn't had a woman heading the foreign ministry. So I think it'll be a great symbol, right? There's some names. I don't want to talk about names, but I think that's the first thing. If Lula manages to empower the foreign ministry, as he did back in 2003, he'll be able to run a very successful foreign policy strategy. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think that the institutional logic of Brazil's foreign policy has changed in the last 12 years. So Itamaraty, the foreign ministry of Brazil, used to be very strong, and we used to say in academia that Itamaraty had a virtual monopoly over foreign policy making, and this is no longer true. Many things have happened since Lula stepped out of office. So I think that Lula will have to find a new place for Itamaraty in the broader logic of his administration. For example, there will be a ministry of indigenous peoples. There will probably be a special ministry or special secretary of climate change. So I think that Itamaraty will have a different role from what he used to have back in the day. But at the same time, Lula is a man who respects Brazil's diplomatic tradition. I think he understands that Brazil's power does not stem from military or economic clout. It stems from reputation. And Lula has successfully increased Brazil's reputation abroad. So I think that Lula will respect the traditions of foreign policy and try to make a very progressive and robust foreign policy strategy. But then there's a third thing, which is the context, right? The global context has dramatically changed, not just because China and the U.S. now they are engaged in a new kind of Cold War, a trade war, technology war. It will be challenging for Lula to position himself in between the two big economic powers. But I think that Lula, he can be friends with Biden as he was friends with George Bush, and he can deal with Xi Jinping. So I think Lula knows the recipe for that. But it will be challenging because Brazil is no longer seen as an emerging power. Brazil is a regional power that has to reconstruct its regional base. And this is also going to be a challenge because Bolsonaro and Temer have destroyed most of the regional structures that held the region together. And if I could place some bets here, I'd say that Lula will have a very strong focus on solving the Venezuelan crisis. Venezuela has been in dire straits for a long time now, and I think that Lula is a man who could serve as interlocutor as of both Maduro and the opposition. So I think that Lula will try to work on that. I mean, Brazil's diplomacy has been known in history for its capacity to mediate, and yeah. So I think that that's one thing. Lula has got to look into Africa, to look at Africa as part of his foreign policy strategy. I mean, we have lost so many opportunities of trade with Africa. Africa is growing consistently for many years now. So I think that we can even reestablish our industrial base and export industrial goods to African countries. And of course, the Middle East and Asia in general will also be a point of opportunity and concern. I don't think that Lula will have the chance to do such a sound Middle Eastern policy as he did in his first time for his first time in office. But I think that, for example, Southeast Asia, South Asia, India, these countries will be very important for Lula's strategy, thinking about the long-term implications of foreign policy.
So Brazil initiated the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa initiative, helped found a bank. The problem, it seems to me, with BRIC is who are the co-partners in that bloc? Russia, which is involved in a very ferocious war against the Ukraine and is not at all an example of democracy. China, which, although a very strong international power and competing with the United States, is certainly not a democratic institution. India is dominated by the far right. I think the only place we can point to of a country that's trying to retain its democratic institutions is South Africa. How will Lula, as this new representative of the broad democracy against the far right, interact with countries, some of which are part of the far right?
Well, Jim, there's a word that has long been part of our diplomatic jargon, which is pragmatism. And I think that Lula is a very pragmatic leader when it comes to doing business with other countries. Many people say that Lula loves dictatorships and supports dictatorships across the world. That's not true. But Lula has to deal as a country, as the president of one of the biggest economies in the world. He's got to deal with non-democratic countries from a trade perspective. And one of the things that Celso Amorim, our former foreign minister, used to say, and I totally agree with him, Brazil's reputation is what makes Brazil powerful. And because of its reputation, it cannot just point fingers at countries and judge them for human rights violations. We have to work to solve human rights issues in every country in the world, but this can only be achieved through dialogue. And I think that Lula and his administration are very conscious that dialogue is the only way to solve problems, not only internal problems, but also diplomatic issues across the world. So I think that this is one of the things. The BRICS should remain in place as a very important mechanism of technical cooperation, funding, and economic cooperation on many levels. So I think the BRICS remain a very important tool for Brazil's foreign policy. But I also think that given the new reality of the world, Lula should look or should focus on the region of South America. Of course, we could think of Latin America more broadly, but I think that South America is Brazil's natural environment for diplomatic initiatives. So I think that Lula could just reestablish some of the institutions that have been done away with in the last years, like UNASUR. But to do so, he has to work on the Venezuelan issue. So, because if he successfully does it, he will kill the narrative that left-wing governments are akin to dictatorships. So I think that because that's what has driven so many people against Lula. Bolsonaro has very successfully created this narrative that if Lula gets elected, we're going to become the next Venezuela or the next Nicaragua or the next Argentina or whatever. And of course, they fail to realize, or they don't want to realize at all, that the problems in these countries, they have less to do with ideology and more to do with structural inequalities and problems that have been around for so long. I mean, Argentina's economic crisis didn't start yesterday. So I think that if Lula has a very favorable South American environment, because now we have progressive and democratic governments in Chile, in Bolivia, in Colombia, in Argentina, just as in Bolivia. So I think that that's the window of opportunity for Lula to reaffirm democracy, to reaffirm progressive values, and to reaffirm the beauty and the need for integration. Because Brexit has been a blow to integration in Europe. And why can't South America serve as the counterexample, as a continent that's being brought together and not being torn apart?
So to end our conversation today, are you optimistic?
Well, I am. I have to be, as a citizen, as a political scientist, and as a researcher of the far right. I still think that there will be dark days ahead, and I know it's an uphill battle for Lula and for anyone who believes in democracy in Brazil. But I'm optimistic because I know that if democracy is preserved, anything else can happen, right? We have our differences. We can sit down and talk about them. We can discuss on a rational level what's wrong about the country. And this is one thing that Bolsonaro has totally obstructed: the possibility for dialogue, the possibility for compromise. And just to think that now I will not look at some friends of mine, some relatives, some students of mine, and see them as part of a different reality. I think that's a great starting point, right? So I'm optimistic in this sense, yes.
That's wonderful. Guilherme, we need to bring you back to talk a lot more about the far right. I'm really curious to know more about your research. There's a lot to see and to understand. And as you pointed out, they're not going away. So we need to really understand what's going on with the far right in Brazil and internationally. I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered.
My pleasure, Jim. Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.